On today's World Insight, highlights and milestones of China diplomacy in 2023. Here are ways the nation made a big difference in world affairs with its foreign policy.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with CGTN Wei. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spelled out on Tuesday China's foreign policy milestones in the year 2023 and China's vision for diplomacy for the year 2024. Wang called 2023, quote, a year of exploration and harvest for China's diplomacy. Looking ahead, he said China will remain committed to openness and inclusiveness for global partnerships. Wang adds China is keen on sharing new opportunities with the world amid a new development momentum. So what does the speech tell us about China's diplomatic goals for the year 2024, and how will these goals benefit the world? Time to return to our panelists. On China's diplomacy in Berlin, Ulrich Bruckner, who is the Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies at Stanford University. Joining us in New Delhi, Swaran Singh, Professor of Nehru University, and in Beijing, Rong Ying, Senior Research Fellow from China Institute for International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Professor Rong, go to you first. This is the first grand speech given by Chinese Foreign Minister and also Director of the Foreign Affairs Office. Tell me more about your general impression as to where China's diplomacy is heading for this year.
What makes the most significant is the first major speech by Director and Minister Wang Yi after the convening of the Central Conference conference on the work related to foreign affairs that was held 1 week time. China is continuing to develop a very strong sense of responsibilities and also to work hard together with the international community as a whole to play a role of a responsible major country to help find a way to address the challenges facing this world, and for the sake of China's own development, to fulfillment of development goals, and also for the peace and stability of the world, which is very much important for China and the world as well.
Well, I think the world is now aware of the fact that the weight and the connections of China come together with the wish to take more responsibility. What I saw in the overview is more low-hanging fruits, like getting closer ties with countries that have the same worldview and share a similar perspective for the future, or enlarging the relationship with BRICS. This is relatively easy to achieve. I haven't really seen much about how to reach out to improve relations with the United States or to improve relations with Europe. There's a lot of reference to the more closer picture, while we urgently need the weight of China to improve the dysfunctional system in the world order and to reach out to find common solutions. There's no word about climate change. I understand that this is not particularly a diplomatic question, but something that affects practically everything. And I haven't really seen much about how to improve the global economic situation.
I think such a policy speech from China's top and seasoned diplomat is drawing attention as to how China looks at having, sort of reached a stage where it is trying to redefine its approach to world affairs. On top of his priorities, obviously, is description of how last year has achieved a certain stabilization as far as United States relationship was concerned. On top of his priorities obviously now is the relationship with the United States, which had come under certain tensions since President Donald Trump's period and had continued in that tone for a certain period of time. But last November, a meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden has brought in a certain stabilization in that big relationship. Second, I think, is most important issue for the speech was expansion of BRICS nations, which also has implications for China's efforts to bring in global South to the center stage. And of course, direct engagement with Africa is going to be something which will see Foreign Minister Wang Yi again visiting to Africa, which is where normally he visits first in the beginning of the year. And of course, the whole focus on multilateralism, strengthening multilateralism as an approach to foreign policy is again something which was underlined. So in that sense, I think it's a certain amount of reassurance of China contributing to overall stabilization of global affairs. And especially when it comes to the recent period, having seen Ukraine war and Israel war in Gaza, I think that has also distracted global attention away from issues like the Taiwan issue at some stage had become significant cause of tension between the United States and China. Now, indeed, China is seen contributing to stabilizing the situation in Middle East, a role that China played in ensuring Saudi Arabia and Iran coming closer is underlined here. So I think it's fundamentally the re-looking and redefining of China, how it wishes to engage in global affairs.
Professor Bruckner, what do you make of the significance of San Francisco meeting between the two presidents? How much do you see that could be the start of the very start of somewhat a new page in a ever-evolving picture between China and developed economies, including Europe?
Well, I think it was urgently needed to reach out and to set a more constructive tone, because we have seen for many years now a much more confrontational perspective on both sides, and that also negatively affects public opinion. When I only look at my country, China was always seen basically a trade partner, and we have mutual benefits. And there are, of course, also political dimensions. I always have problems with this distinction. This is economic and this is political. Because if we only look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's clearly both. And the same applies to the relations between China and the European Union. But what we have seen in the relationship between the United States and China, it sounds much more like a global, not only competition, but rivalry in the sense of, if we develop a future multilateral order, whose rules are applied in this multilateral order? And this needs to be openly addressed. Otherwise, it looks like a power play, and we end up with a multipolar world in which the rule of the powerful is the one that defines the future of the planet, and this is not healthy.
Professor Rong, it seems that Professor Bruckner is trying to indicate that there has not been strategies clearly lined up as to how China is going to deal with the global north. In other words, developed economies such as the United States and Europe. Is that what you also hear from the speech?
No, on the contrary, I would argue that the speech made very clear about its thinking, about the approach, and the purposes and the goals that China is looking for in terms of its relationship with the global north, if I can say in general, and with the United States and Europe in particular. I think in the speech, Minister Wang Yi made it very clear for United States is looking for a kind of way for two major countries, the largest developed countries and the developing countries, to find a way to get along together for the new era. And for that, he specifically referred to the common understanding and the consensus arising from the San Francisco summit, which I think is defined as San Francisco vision, and also call upon a joint effort to implement the vision, to find a way to promote cooperation
and address differences. With Europe in general, again, I think the speech made it very clear that the purposes of China's relationship with Europe is we will again work together to ensure that the choices by China and Europe will lead to a sort of a world or in a situation where it would not only benefit China and Europe, but also the world as a whole, as we are facing so many challenges and so many problems ahead.
Well, I think we all hear the same speech, but we make different conclusions from it. What people in Europe in particular miss is that on the one hand, China praises its ability to negotiate in conflicts like the successful mentioning of Saudi Arabia-Iran conversations, and this is missing in the case of Russia and Ukraine. I continued saying since the beginning of the Russian invasion in Ukraine that no one has more leverage on Russia than China.
With due respect, I would beg to defer in terms of Professor Buchanan's sort of perception of the role of China on the question of the Ukraine crisis, or the leverages or the role that China should have played. I would argue that it is, again, a known fact. China is not directly parties concerned with the conflict. It is Europe and to some extent NATO and the United States has the key, hold the key for the solution or any sort of way out of the crisis. And in the meantime, China has made great efforts in this regard, and not only announcing its position paper, putting forward the positions related to the use of nuclear weapons, and also I think by sending special envoys and playing a role to help. And last but not least, I think it is true, if we look at the speech, Wang Yi made it very clear the last highlights, the 6 highlights of China's diplomacy last year, 2023, with help to bring Saudis and Iran together by providing the good health, good office. And this is exactly, I think, the message China is trying to send out. If Europe is able to work with Russia and to find a way to address the problem of Ukraine, I think China, like other sort of, peace-loving countries or those who have already contributed in terms of initiative and idea, will play a role. But as the saying goes, you can bring the 2 cows to the river, but you cannot force them to drink.
Going to China's relationship with the global south, once again, it's a very general term. Professor Singh, how do you see the approaches that China has taken? One, of course, is community of shared future, the expansion of BRICS, the Belt and Road Initiative. One could also argue being the bridge between Saudi Arabia and Iran is also part of that. So tell me more about how do you see China's approach to the global south, quote unquote?
Thank you, Tianwei. I think you mentioned several approaches that China has applied in last 1 or 2 decades in engaging with the global south, particularly a major engagement with Africa, for example. The difference in China's approach now is that apart from building a strong economic relationship, investment relationship in building projects, now China is beginning to participate in influencing the narratives as to how those relationships around the world should be built. So 3 important initiatives of last year plus that President Xi has taken in terms of Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative is a way to participate and influence the narrative as to how those relationships should be built. And I think China definitely remains, perhaps right now, very strongly engaged with Global South. And from there, trying to emerge as a voice of Global South, emerging as an important influence on Global South, and taking Global South's voices, interests, and concerns to the global big tables, to the global north. And I think that is where the challenge lies in coming years, that China has already built enough strong relationship with the Global South, also has a strong economic relationship with Global North, but now needs to also build similar relationship at the level of sharing narratives in terms of standards, norms, institutions to be built to ensure stable conduct of global affairs with the Global North.
One of the things, Professor Buchner, many here are concerned about is whether the world will be only divided or more than anything else divided by ideologies. What do you make of that apparent artificial divide? How to make sure that we are approaching it in a more holistic process rather than one-sided approach? Professor Bruckner.
Well, the good news from the speech is that there's a clear reference to multilateralism. And for many years, people in the North were concerned that we do have a system of multilateralism that is based on the rule of law. And that is now at risk if one hears too much about a multipolar world, which sounds like everyone is doing what everyone can do, what we have witnessed, for example, in the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And that should be replaced by sitting down and finding a global order that is based on rules and norms, or what my colleague from India is referring to, a narrative that we share by using existing international institutions or inventing new ones, and not referring to something like what you said rightly, an artificial divide between geographies, because this is not so much about geographies. This is about how we operate as our social contracts, our political order, our economic system. And we live in a shrinking world in which we have so much in common that we can only address global challenges together.
Professor Rong, how much do you see, as presented by Professor Bruckner, would help China in a way to find the right approaches to what we call the global north?
Yeah, I think again, this is I would argue that the common challenges facing the world, certainly including China, Europe, and to some extent the United States. And China again has been, by putting forward the initiative or the vision for building a community of shared future and the 3G global initiative, it's aimed at, or it's making an attempt to provide Chinese sort of thinking or Chinese vision to address, the division or the divide between global north and global north and south, particularly on finding a way to address the challenges. And last but not least, I think China also made it very clear that it is ready to work with Europe, work with the United States to make this initiative or these initiatives more workable, more effective. That is exactly, I think, China is what has made, make the argument by promoting or advocating the idea of true multilateralism. But the most important thing China has, again, repeatedly said, it is not want to build up or set up a new sort of international order or system. Rather, it want to make this system, the current system, more equitable, more accountable, and more effective.
Several moving elements. One is the U.S. Presidential election, which many consider as one of the biggest uncertainties of the world in the year 2024 and probably beyond. The other thing is economies are going through different stages in their development. As you say, geopolitics is so closely related to geoeconomics. How do you see these different elements are likely to have an impact on what all of you have been beautifully illustrating about diplomacy 2024? Professor Bruckner.
Well, it only underlines how important it is to stay in close contact and to use all possible diplomatic channels to better understand how we all see the world and what we would prefer as practical solutions, and not like getting lost in ideological battles or very big pictures that don't lose the ability to address the problems on the ground. There is so much that urgently needs to be addressed, and that uses diplomatic tools that we should learn from the positive examples of last year, that diplomacy can help fix problems, and that multilateralism is not something that we have to invent because it's already there, but we have to sit down and see how we can improve this.
Professor Singh.
I think, first of all, elections in the United States will keep the leaders fairly engaged in terms of domestic engagements, may not see them traveling too often to attend international forums. But nevertheless, when it comes to United States, foreign policy remains integral part of the speeches made by leaders in contestations with each other during their election speeches. So foreign policy narratives will continue, but mostly at home rather than in international forums in that sense. But nevertheless, I think this year is also a year of elections around the world. I was reading somewhere 70 countries are going for elections. And that to me does create a certain amount of vibrancy, certain amount of enthusiasm, certain amount of activism in all these countries, which should help them revive their geoeconomics, but also have perhaps positive spin-off impact on the political relationships, particularly of the major powers who are trying to find out how to really come back and restart dealing with each other on more normal terms, rather than ratcheting up the relationship. So I would possibly hope that this year would see major powers relations stabilizing. And issues like Ukraine had sort of disrupted that relationship last year should be addressed and stabilized in this year.
I think that's exactly one of the purposes of the speech or China's diplomacy is meant to. That is, say, in this uncertain and fluid world, and particularly we're talking about the linking or interwoven of the geopolitics and geoeconomics. In which I think unprecedentedly we have so many countries, major countries, United States and Russia, India certainly, and Europe. I mean, we're also talking about the changes. I mean, in the elections may, lead to changes, unpredictable changes, reflecting the dynamics at home, the politics, the polarization, and all these are going to create, uncertainties. And so what we need at this moment most is certainties, is stabilities. And I think China's diplomacy is one of the, for Chinese diplomacy is make efforts to help provide some sense of stability and predictability. That's why the speech is very much important in not only setting out its goals, but emphasizing the purposes of Chinese diplomacy. If you talk about the globalization, I think again, the speech says very well about asking for inclusive and equitable, balanced economic globalization. And of course, the multilateralism.
China's economy is in transition. The growth rate has been going down rather than up. Well, probably many economists suggest that's the most natural thing. You cannot expect an economy to grow with rapid speed all the time. But that does bring some change to the interactions between China and the developing world. And yet, with China's economy in transition, the logic will not change, and yet the way of doing things might be changing. So what does that mean to the nature of China's diplomacy, and also to the ways China is to do its diplomacy with the global south, with the developing countries?
China is making great efforts, and I think has made some big progress in terms of transforming the development model or development sort of approach from high rate of growth to high quality ones by focusing very much on domestic consumption, on the further reform and opening up. And in this regard, that's why China, again, the speech mentioned a lot about opposing a kind of divide, bringing decoupling and or de-risking. And that is because not only undermine China's effort in transforming itself, but more importantly, it would create more problems in the process where, the other countries, together with this, to pursue their transition. The answer to that is, of course, China continue asking for more integrated, more opening up, and more sort of efforts in reform itself, reinventing itself, and also working together, looking for new areas of cooperation.
Larger economies, of course, cannot continue to rise at that kind of level which China did in 1990s and for several decades since. Fundamentally, therefore, we have seen Chinese leaders over a period of time shifting the focus to quality and equity and justice. That faces additional challenges because we see now West as disinclined partner to not allow China to grow as rapidly as China would like to be. And therefore, I think the focus has shifted in other directions in terms of engaging global South, in terms of engaging in global narratives, influencing and building parallel large platforms like BRICS nations, for example. And I think, therefore, the time now is one of redefining the approach to global affairs. And that is where I think Wang Yi's speech is very interesting, which is part of the overall relooking that China has been doing in terms of starting new policy, new methods, new approaches in engaging in global affairs. It has seen some of the sort of results which are positive, but the challenges still remain. And I think we will see China in this year as well, trying to overcome several of the challenges, both at domestic level and in its global engagements.
Rong Ying, Svaran Singh, and Ulrich Bruckner, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Appreciate it. And that's all the time for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight in our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of my team. Thanks for being with us.